Hello, everyone. This is Debra Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Need training? Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of weekly live and on-demand training sessions. Plus, get access to vendor setup form templates and reference tools that will help you and your team to reduce the potential for fraud, compliance fines, and just overall bad vendor data. So sign up for a free account to get access to free training sessions, vendor process FAQs, and a resource library with information you need to manage your vendor master file. Visit training.debrarrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Around April of every year, right after the tax filing season for 1099s and 1042s, the vendor teams definitely know they have some issues with their vendor data. Now, if you clean your vendor master file only once per year, that could be the problem. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 381, 5 reasons why annual vendor master file cleanups fail in 2026 and how often it should be done. And let me just clarify here. I said how often it fails in 2026, but you know what? Annual vendor master file cleanups or cleaning your vendor master file on an annual basis, in my view, has always failed because by that time, you have a big task. So most of you know, if you've listened to my podcast, met me in person, been to any of my webinars, right? I talk a lot about vendor setup and maintenance because I used to do that. I was a practitioner. I had a team of 17. I worked for a Fortune 50 company. So we had a lot of vendors. We had 140,000 across 7 different ERPs. That converted to about 30,000 1099s and 1042s. And those 140,000 vendors, active vendors, by the way, across those 7 ERPs, those, right, were our vendor master files that we had to keep clean. And I'll tell you how often we used to do it at the end when I get to that part. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about when you really start to notice it. And then we'll talk about the 5 reasons why annual vendor reviews are no longer good enough. And again, I say no longer or not in 2026, but I don't think they were ever good enough. And then lastly, I'll talk about how often I think it should be done. And then in the show notes, I will have a link to a recording of an 8-step process to clean your vendor master file. So let's go ahead and get started. Right. So let's start with when you start to notice that your vendor data in your vendor master file is probably not where it needs to be. So first off, it probably started during the tax preparation process itself, when you were getting ready, right, to get the data ready for your 1099s, your 1042s, populating that data. Maybe at that point you found that you generated, right, your 1099s, for example, for U.S. vendors, and found that you had duplicate vendor records for the same vendor. So that can happen. Then the other thing most people will do, right, before tax preparation, they'll do the 10 match at that point. And now you find that you've got some 10 numbers that 10 numbers or taxpayer identification numbers and legal name combinations for your vendors that do not match. And so that happened. And now you found out that again, right, your vendor data in your vendor master file is no longer or is not good. And then, so that's during tax preparation, but you probably found out more after tax preparation, right? After you sent out your 1099s and your 1042s. Because number one, you probably got back some of those forms because the addresses weren't formatted correctly, weren't standardized, or your vendors no longer were at the address that you sent it to. So those got sent back to you. Also, you may be getting right in April, CP 2100 and CP 2100 or CP 2100A notices because they come in October and April. Now, to be fair, these notices, CP 2100 or CP 2100A notices that come, those come to say that the forms that you file with the IRS that contain the vendor legal names and the tax IDs, that the combinations didn't match IRS 10 records. Now, again, to be fair, those are really for last season. So in October, you get the season that you have filed. And then, notifications that legal name, tax ID combination didn't match. And then in April, you get the leftovers. And I say leftovers, but it's all your corrections. So if you file corrections in April, you'll get notified if any of those corrections that you filed did not have, or the legal name tax IDs did not match. And so, yes, you could be getting those, but it is for the prior season. But that is still might be a hit and a half. If you haven't changed what you're doing, that you're probably going to get, right, CP 2100, CP 2100A notices in October. And the only difference between whether you're going to get a CP 2100 or CP 2100A notice is CP 2100A notice is 50 or less, and then CP 2100 is 50 or more. You definitely, if you had a choice, right, only want to get the CP 2100A if you had to get them at all. Then another thing you can find that will trigger or let you know that, your vendor master file may not be up to snuff is the vendor calls that you get. And so you may have some vendors that are calling you that said they did not get a 1099 and are wondering where it's at. And so maybe you did not enter that vendor correctly, right, in the vendor master file as reportable. Or maybe you had a wrong address and it never did reach them and it didn't also return to you yet either. And so those vendor calls can be a great way to identify other incorrect or other inaccuracies in your vendor master file that needs to be cleaned up. And so I know it's a pain to get those calls, and I would assign them to different team members, and no one ever wanted to really talk to the vendors because most of the time our information was correct, and my team members, and you probably have done this before too, just had to listen and kind of be berated by some of these vendors that did not want that much income reported to the IRS, or just wrong in their assumption that they did not, or that we did not pay them as much as we actually paid them. However, the other side of that coin is that they can let you know when your information is not correct, and hopefully they can do it before the corrections on the IRS penalty schedule, before the date of the next increase in the penalties for corrections being filed. All right. So you've noticed that you've got some issues with your vendor master file. And if you are one of the ones that will clean up your vendor master file on your annual basis. And just note that not judging at all, because most of the teams that I talk to are doing their or cleaning up their vendor master file on an annual basis. And it's as if that's just how it's done. It's not expected to be cleaned more than once a year. But I have to tell you, that really no longer works in 2026. And it never really did. But it's something that is, and I understand why it's being done on an annual basis. At least one of the biggest reasons why is because it's mostly a manual process. There's not a lot of systems. Some accounting systems and ERPs will have a way to like inactivate vendors if, your company hasn't done business with them in 15, 18, 24, 36 months, whatever your threshold of inactivity is. And so that part is a manual process. And so are the next steps of revalidating that information. And again, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to a recording of an 8-step process to clean your vendor master file. But I will tell you now, right? It's just most of those steps, and probably all of them, depending on what tools you have, are a manual process. And so that's why it doesn't get done as often as it needs to be. But I will tell you that when I was a practitioner with those 140,000 active vendors across 7 different ERPs, only 2 of those ERPs had a process to automatically inactivate vendor records. And the rest of the ERPs and then the rest of those 8 steps were all performed on a monthly basis. So let's talk about 5 reasons why I think annual vendor cleanups are just not good enough. So the first reason is because information can change. And you know what? The vendors just don't tell you. I mean, they can make a change to their tax ID or to the legal name. Or maybe they've been merged with another company or acquired by another company, which changes their name and or their tax ID. And a lot of that stuff happens in January. And so, or whenever their tax year is, which, right, could be January. Well, the problem is that they may submit a change to you, for example, in banking because they changed their name, they've changed their tax ID, and so now they have a new bank account. And so they will make that change or submit that change to you because they want to get paid. But they don't know that you also need to know that their tax ID changed or that their legal name changed. And so what I would typically recommend is whenever a vendor has a change in banking, if you do not have on that bank change form and your own bank change form, by the way, fields for them to enter in their company name and their tax ID so you can catch it, then also have them submit to you a W-9 or your vendor setup form that maybe doubles as a substitute W-9. And have them submit that to you so that you can identify, do your tax ID or your 10 match tax ID legal name combination check, right, to verify that it is still the same. And if the trigger for, a new bank account was because, right, they have new information, they were merged, they acquired, or they changed their information, then you will catch it at that time. And so if you wait until the end of the year, which is when most of the folks will do their vendor master file cleanup and or 10 check, then now you've gone all year where you haven't you didn't take advantage of the fact that you could have asked them earlier in the year, so you wouldn't have to wait until now to do it. And that's actually another reason we'll talk about the timing of that at year end, trying to do the vendor master file cleanup. But that information changes. And the vendors could have told you throughout the year, but they didn't. And so you only catch it when you do the annual cleanup. The next thing is, and this is a big one, this is that the watch lists themselves, right? That you have to check your vendor's legal name against to verify that they're not on any watch lists that you should not that apply to you. That means you should not be paying that vendor. And the biggest one is OFAC, right? Especially for U.S. entities and individuals that are prohibited from paying vendors that are on that list. Well, those lists are not static. They change and often. And if you are only checking once a year, that means that you only have one time after onboarding that you're going to check that vendor to see if they've been added to a watch list since you checked them last or since they were originally onboarded. And by that time, if they were added, for example, to the OFAC list, now you have most likely paid that vendor. If it's a recurring vendor payment, you've most likely paid them when you shouldn't have. And, forget about IRS interest and penalties. If you want to talk about penalties, talk about the U.S. Department of Treasury and the OFAC penalties, right? You can get civil penalties and also criminal penalties. And they even have a page that is kind of dedicated to the penalties that have been assessed in the millions. So it shows the entity or the organizations that have been penalized. And I know Facebook is on that list, and they've been assessed penalties that are in the millions, along with other organizations as well. And so you do want to make sure that you're checking those watch lists more than annually. Now, the next thing is, and you may not think about this either, is the bank branch information can change and vendors just don't pay attention. They definitely don't let you know. And we saw like 3 or 4 years ago back in, what was it, 2021, 2022, maybe 2023, where 2 banks failed. And then the next year, another bank failed. So, banks fail. And when that happens, their assets and accounts are purchased by another bank, which changes the routing number. Also, just like with the vendors' companies, banks will merge and banks get acquired all the time. And guess what? That means that their routing number changes or their bank branch information changes. So it could be their big code if it's a non-U.S. Financial institution that does not use IBANs. If it's a non-U.S. financial institution that uses IBANs, then that IBAN can change because the IBAN includes the bank branch identifier. And so you do want to make sure that you always have updated bank branch information so that your payments are successful and you don't, end up with any fines or penalties because you've been sending erroneous information, in your pay files to the bank. Because sometimes they will change, the banks will change it, either your bank, I don't know if it's your bank or the vendor's bank, like if the routing number changes, because, they have that information. But they're not going to keep changing it every time. At some point, you're going to get in trouble for continuing to send that information. And so if you wait to the end of the year to check it, you probably have already, right, received a notice of change, for example, from your bank letting you know that they changed it. But, in order for that payment to be successful, but, they're not going to keep doing that. And that can make you susceptible to nacha fines for like U.S. banks. So you do want to make sure you're doing that more than once a year. And for those of you that didn't have it on your step list, right, or on your checklist when you're cleaning your vendor master file, to also check the bank branch information, you need to add that. And so again, I will have a link to the 8-step process to clean your vendor master file. And it does include a step to check your vendor bank branch information as well. And then the fourth reason is that Vendor team members, even though you might have it in your process, some of you may not, are just not standardizing or formatting addresses to correctly mail whatever you are sending. And so whether that is checks and then the checks come back, or whether, like I said before, you're getting back 1042s and 1099s, right, since February or March, when you sent them out, if you were mailing them. And so, or maybe other things that you were mailing to the vendors. And so you don't want to wait until the end of the year in order to, or once a year in order to do that cleanup, because that is something that can take some time, especially if you do not have a upload or somewhere where you can do a bulk upload to check that. Even if you do, it's still going to take some time to get that done. And so what I recommend, I used to recommend that you do the address validation on a monthly basis, but now I recommend that you do one bulk upload that'll standardize all of them, all of your addresses in your vendor master file, and then you can update them and then make sure going forward that your vendor team members are following the process to standardize and format the addresses before or when they are entered into the accounting system or ERP. And this is an offsite, but in order to ensure that that be done, you might have to implement or a vendor process audit, not just an annual audit or, when your external auditors come in, but you can have that done by your internal auditors or just anyone that does not have access to add or edit the vendor master file. And then that way you can be sure that your vendor team are performing all of the, steps that are in your vendor process that you put in place to avoid fraud, fines, and bad vendor data, like standardizing and formatting addresses so that they are mailable and you can verify that they are valid. All right. And then the fifth reason, I kind of talked about this before, is that usually when an annual review is done, it's done at year end because that's right before tax reporting season. And right, you just clean it up at the time that you're going to be doing your annual IRS bulk 10 match. But that is the reason that it fails or it's not good enough, is because by this time you have probably already paid the vendor, and especially those vendors that were probably just a one-time paying the vendor, or all of the invoices for all of the products, all the services being done has already been received or the services have already been performed. And so trying to reach back out to the vendors that where the IRS 10 match was not good, is hard because now you don't have any leverage. There are no pending any invoices that you can threaten to, not send payment for, or probably not that, but there are no invoices that you can threaten to back up withhold if they don't send, right, a valid tax ID or legal name combination, right? And so you no longer have leverage. So that's one thing about waiting to year end. And then a second reason is, right, vendor teams are just busy with year end activities, right? How many vendors do we typically have to set up, at year end because invoices have sat on desk all year round, but now they got to get paid. And so now those vendors need to be set up. And so the activity and the volume is just higher. And so trying to also deal with reaching out to those vendors that did not pass validation, right, to collect updated information is just additional tasks that is that has to be on the same team members' plates that are trying to get these vendors set up to get, right, invoices paid by year end. And then the other thing too is when you're reaching out to these vendors for, tax ID combinations that didn't match, tax ID legal name combinations that didn't match, IRS 10 records to get that updated W-9, they're busy too because it's year end. And so This is already the longest part of the vendor cleanup process because, vendors don't always make it a priority when you reach out and ask for a W-9 or other updated information. But trying to do it at year end is even worse because they are busy too. And then the last part of it is, if you wait until year end to get it done, then what if they never reply? And, or what if they take 3 months to reply, but you have to file in, January? Means that you're going to be doing your tax filing with the IRS with a missing 10 or an incorrect legal name tax ID combination, which, right, will result in a CP 2100, CP 2100A notice. And so you definitely don't want to do that. You want to give yourself time throughout the year that you can tackle these problems in enough time so that when it gets to the point where you're year end or January, you're not stuck with bad vendor data that could result in fines and penalties for your company. Okay, so I talked about the 5 reasons why annual reviews are just not enough. And so now I want to talk about how often you should be cleaning your vendor master file. So first of all, let's just talk about continuous monitoring. Continuous monitoring, I think, is great. If you have, tools for it or a platform to do that. And continuous monitoring can be done for many of the validations, one of which is like the OFAC or other watch lists that your company is required to check your vendors against. A lot of those can be done via continuous monitoring. Now, I know that many of you probably use the free lookups where you just go and type in their name and do the lookup. But there are companies out there, and especially if you have something like a vendor self-registration portal where the information is already there, there are continuous monitoring, right, programs or platforms that you can use so that you will be notified if your vendor is added to, an applicable watch list that you are required to check your vendors against. So that's great. And there are some other continuous monitoring as well. I'm not sure if they have one for the IRS 10 match, right? That's clearly an important one. But depending on a third party provider, they may have different validations that you are interested in turning on continuous monitoring for. But any other validations that are not included, those you will need to do separately. And how often should you be doing those, right? So I will tell you here that I equate, right, cleaning your vendor master file, not just, a step here or a step there. And again, if you want to click through and watch the recording of cleaning your vendor master file, I talk about doing all 8 steps each time you clean your vendor master file. And so that's from inactivating vendors, revalidating their information, looking for duplicate vendors, those types of things every time, not just, kind of a one by one basis. And so if you have something like continuous monitoring, that's fine. But anything that is not included with that, any validation or any step of the process not included in that continuous monitoring, you want to do that every time you clean your vendor master file. All right. So if you don't have continuous monitoring, what is the next best step? So the next best, well, not step, but the next best interval. So the next best interval is at each pay cycle. And why do I say at each pay cycle? Because when you are paying your vendors, right, these watch lists, the exclusion or what you're not supposed to do is you're not supposed to, or you're prohibited from paying vendors that appear on these lists. And so what better time to check is before you send that pay cycle out. So when your company generates a pay cycle, before that file is sent to the bank for ACH or wire payments, before that file is sent to the printer for check payments, have those vendors that are on that pay file checked against the applicable watch list. And then that way, if your vendors have subsequently been added to a watch list, you can catch it before that next payment goes out. So that would mean that you would be doing your vendor master file cleanup at a really quick interval, because most of you probably have pay files on a weekly basis. Now, this is the only one where I would say you might be able to get away with only doing the watch list check. However, the next interval, if you're not doing it each pay cycle, is on a monthly basis. And this is the one that we used to use when I was a practitioner. We would clean those vendor master files on a monthly basis. But I will tell you, if I had the ability to do continuous monitoring, I would have, but we didn't. If I had the ability to check the watch list at each pay cycle, I would have, but we didn't. Nowadays, both of those options are more readily available. Now, if you can't do either of those, or you can only do, let's say, the watch list monitoring or the watch list for, continuous monitoring or at each pay cycle, the next best is monthly. And this is what we used to do as when I was a practitioner for those 7 accounting system or ERPs for that house those 140,000 active vendors. We would clean those vendor master files on a monthly basis. And that's 8 steps, which included inactivating the vendors, doing all the validations, duplicate vendor review, right? All 8 steps of that process were done on a monthly basis. And the best part of that is that on a monthly basis, if you are dealing with vendors, right, whose validations were not successful, you've got less vendors that you have to deal with versus waiting to, do them all on an annual basis. So you catch the ones quickly that where their information has changed and they haven't told you. And so you can deal with it right then and there versus waiting to the end of the year. And however long the vendor takes to get back to you, at least, right, you've got more time than having to file because you waited to the end of the year, right? Having to file with the IRS when you know that the information is not good, filing that, erroneous legal name, tax ID combination just because you haven't heard from the vendor. And you don't want to do, and I didn't say this before, but you don't want to file with a missing tone, because if you do that, when you get the CP 2100, CP 2100A notice, it's going to trigger automatic backup withholding. And so you file the erroneous information knowing that you're going to get that notification, but at least now you can just do the letter first. All right. So if you can't do continuous monitoring or at each pay cycle, then do it on a monthly basis. And then if you can't do it on a monthly basis, I recommend you do it on a quarterly basis. And this is the one that I recommend, especially if you have a smaller vendor master file or a number of active vendors. And when I say smaller, I mean like less than 5,000. When you start getting 5,000, 10,000 more, you really need to do that more often. I recommend monthly, just to make sure that for the vendors that you have to follow up with, that it is, a reasonable amount. So you're not waiting till the end of the year or once a year and then have a large volume to have to deal with. And then if you can't do it quarterly, then semi-annually. And if you do it semi-annually, I recommend that the second one be done around October-ish, so that if you have to reach out to vendors, at least you have some time before year-end activities start going hot and heavy, or right? You've got at least some time to wait for the vendor to respond in order to get that information in so that when you get to January, it is correct. Now, I typically will say, and at the very least, do it at least annually. But this podcast is about how annually, which is not good enough anymore. I still kind of say that with the caveat that it's not best practice to do it on an annual basis. So hopefully, that's something that, if possible, your team can implement starting with the interval of continuous monitoring. And if you don't have that, not falling below, right, semi-annually in that interval list that I just went. All right, so that is all that I have for you today. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 381st episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.